The kid's black eye was still fresh when he whispered, "Be my dad for a day." But when Walter Colombo's men stormed into that school the next morning, 4 SUVs deep, the whole building froze. And by the time those hallways went silent, everyone realized the real question wasn't why the Mafia boss showed up, but who he was about to destroy next. If you're hooked in and want to enjoy this story, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see where everyone's watching. Plus, tomorrow I've got another incredible story lined up, and you definitely don't want to miss it. Alright, back to the story. The heavy oak door of Walter Colombo's private office swung open on a late Tuesday afternoon, letting in a ribbon of golden light and something nobody in that room expected. A child. George Marino stood in the doorway, backpack hanging off one thin shoulder, his clothes a size too big, his sneakers scuffed and worn at the toes. The warm glow of desk lamps caught the dust particles dancing in the air around him. But it was the shadows under his eyes that told the real story. The room fell silent. Midway conversations died. Cigar smoke hung suspended. Someone's glass paused halfway to their lips. 5 of Walter's most trusted men turned as one, their eyes landing on the boy who'd just walked uninvited into the heart of organized crime. Walter Colombo set down the document he'd been reviewing, his tattooed fingers coming to rest on the dark mahogany desk. His eyes cold, calculating, weathered by decades of violence and survival, locked onto the boy's face with the precision of a man trained to read danger. That's when he saw it. The bruise blooming purple and yellow around George's left eye, swollen enough that the lid drooped slightly, fresh enough that you could still see the angry red edges creeping toward his temple. "You lost, kid," Vincent called from near the window, his massive frame casting shadows across the Persian rug. His voice carried more confusion than threat. George's throat moved as he swallowed hard. His small hands twisted around the worn straps of his backpack, knuckles going white. His sneakers shuffled against the hardwood floor. For a heartbeat, Walter thought the boy might run, but then something shifted. George's narrow shoulders straightened, his chin lifted despite the way his eyes glistened with unshed tears, and he said the words that would crack something open in every dangerous man in that smoke-filled room. Can you be my dad for one day?" The silence that followed carried the weight of decades, every scar these men wore beneath their expensive suits pressed into the moment. Walter's jaw tightened as memories he'd buried deep threatened to surface. Behind him, Vincent shifted the enforcer who'd grown up dodging his father's fists. Across the room, Tony's eyes went dark, the lieutenant, whose old man disappeared when he was 8, leaving nothing but unpaid debts and broken promises. Walter rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. The lamplight caught the edge of the tattoo that crept up from his collar, a serpent coiled around a cross. He crossed the distance between them with measured steps that made no sound. He stopped just in front of George, towering over the boy but somehow making himself less threatening in the process. His tattooed hand reached out slowly, gently tilting George's face toward the light. He studied the bruise with the careful attention of a man who'd given and received violence his entire life, and who knew exactly what kind of impact left that particular pattern. "Who did this to you?" Walter's voice was low, controlled, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut steel. George's lips trembled. His fingers unconsciously touched the tender skin around his eye, then jerked away as if the contact burned. He started, then stopped. His eyes darted to the other men in the room, then back to Walter's face. "I fell off my bike." Vincent snorted softly from behind them. "Try again, kid." Tony moved closer, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He crouched down to George's eye level, his expression surprisingly gentle for a man who'd broken bones for a living. "That bruise," Tony said quietly, "came from someone's knuckles, someone who knew how to hit hard enough to hurt but not hard enough to break anything." He paused. "Someone who's done it before." George's carefully constructed facade shattered. His small chest heaved as he fought back sobs, but the tears came anyway, tracking down his bruised face in silent streams. "Rick." The name came out choked and broken. "My mom's boyfriend. He gets mad when she's at work, and she's always at work now. Double shifts at City General. We need the money since..." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Since my real dad died." Walter's expression didn't change, but every man in the room saw his hands slowly curl into fists at his sides. "Career day is tomorrow." George continued through his tears, the words tumbling out now like he couldn't stop them. "At school, every kid has to bring a parent to talk about their jobs. I don't have anyone." He looked up at Walter with eyes that held more pain than any child should carry. "My dad's gone. My mom works 16-hour shifts just to keep us fed. And Rick," his voice cracked. "Rick's not the career day type." George wiped his face with his sleeve, trying to compose himself. When he looked back at Walter, there was something desperate but also determined in his gaze. I chose you because nobody's afraid of Rick, but everyone is afraid of you. I thought, maybe if someone like you showed up, maybe Rick would finally leave us alone. Walter's tattooed hand came to rest on George's shoulder, protective, grounding, a promise written in the pressure of his grip. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made even his own men straighten unconsciously. Tomorrow morning, kid. I'll be there. But before George could respond, Vincent straightened from his position and said quietly, Boss, you're not going alone. Tony stood. Kid needs more than one guy. Another voice from across the room. Whole crew should go. One by one, every man in that office nodded. Walter's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but carried the same dangerous promise. Wear something nice tomorrow, he told George. We'll handle the rest. If this moment shook you even a little, don't scroll past. Hit subscribe because no child should ever feel this alone again. The office door closed behind George with a soft click, leaving Walter alone with his men and a silence that felt heavier than any decision he'd made in 20 years of running the city's underworld. Walter stood motionless at the window, watching the boy's small frame disappear down the street, backpack bouncing against his too thin shoulders. The evening sun painted everything gold, but all Walter could see was that bruise purple and yellow and screaming with a story he knew too well. Boss? Vincent's voice cut through the quiet. Walter didn't turn around. His reflection in the glass showed a man carved from stone, but his hands were still clenched at his sides, knuckles white beneath the tattoos. I know that look, Tony said softly from his position near the desk. He'd seen it before, the same hollow fear in his own mirror when he was 8 years old, wondering if his mother's boyfriend would come home angry again. The kids living our childhood. Worse, Vincent added, his massive frame settling into one of the leather chairs. At least when we were getting hit, we knew nobody was coming. This kid actually has the guts to ask for help. Walter finally turned, his cold eyes sweeping across his most trusted men. These weren't just employees or soldiers. They were survivors. Every single one of them had crawled out of hell to build something, even if that something lived in the shadows. We're all going, Walter said. It wasn't a question. Damn right we are, Vincent replied immediately. Tony leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Kid said career days tomorrow morning. What time do elementary schools even start? 9:30 probably. Another voice chimed in, Paulo, the crew's accountant, who actually had kids of his own. Presentations usually run from 10 to noon. Walter moved to his desk, pulled out his phone, and sent a single text to George. What time tomorrow? The response came back within seconds. 10 a.m. Room 204. Thank you. Walter stared at those last two words longer than he should have. When was the last time someone had thanked him for anything? In his world, people paid, negotiated, or begged. They didn't say thank you with the kind of desperate sincerity that bled through a text message. 4 SUVs, Walter said, his voice returning to its usual command. Full detail. We show up like we're protecting a diplomat. The school's gonna lose their minds, Vincent said with a dark chuckle. Good, Walter replied. Let them. That's the point. Across the city, George climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, each step feeling heavier than the last. His hand trembled as he unlocked the door, praying Rick was still at the bar downtown. The apartment was dark except for the blue glow of the television. George's heart sank. Rick sat on the couch in a stained undershirt, beer cans scattered on the coffee table. His bloodshot eyes tracked George's movement across the room. Where the hell you been? Rick's words slurred together. Your mom left dinner in the fridge. You were supposed to heat it up for me. I'm sorry, George whispered, keeping his distance, calculating the steps to his bedroom. I had to stay late for a school project. Rick's eyes narrowed, focusing on George's face on the bruise he'd left there just yesterday. For a moment, something that might have been shame flickered across his features, but then he took another swig of beer, and it vanished. Yeah, well, don't make me wait again. He waved a dismissive hand. Get out of here. George didn't need to be told twice. He slipped into his bedroom and locked the door, a flimsy barrier. But it was something. He pressed his back against it, sliding down until he sat on the floor, finally letting himself breathe. His phone buzzed. Walter's text glowed in the darkness. Wear something nice. We'll handle the rest. George read it 3 times, his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Hope. He crawled to his closet and pulled out the only button-up shirt he owned, white with a small stain on the collar that never came out, but it was the best he had. He hung it on his doorknob, then collapsed onto his bed, staring at the ceiling. What if Walter didn't show? What if it was all just words? Adults said things all the time they didn't mean. His mom said Rick would change. Rick said he didn't mean to hit so hard. His teacher said things would get better. But something about Walter felt different. Maybe it was the way his hand had rested on George's shoulder, protective, solid, real. Or maybe it was the look in his eyes, like he understood pain in a language that didn't need words. George closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, he let himself imagine tomorrow. Not with fear or dread, but with the dangerous possibility that someone might actually show up for him. In a garage across town, 4 black SUVs sat in a row, engines purring like sleeping panthers. Walter's men moved with military precision, checking tire pressure, filling gas tanks, cleaning windows until they gleamed. Vincent polished his shoes. Tony pressed his best suit. Paulo made calls to arrange the charity documentation they'd need to prove they were more than just criminals. And Walter sat alone in his office, a glass of bourbon untouched on his desk, staring at a photograph he kept hidden in his drawer. A young boy with bruises, angry and afraid, standing next to a man who should have protected him but didn't. That boy was 30 years dead, buried under scar tissue and survival. But tomorrow, for one morning, Walter Colombo would be the man that boy had needed. He picked up his phone and sent one more text to his entire crew. Tomorrow we protect what matters. No weapons. No threats. We show them who we really are. The responses came back one by one, each a simple affirmation. Tomorrow, career day, would never be the same. George woke before his alarm, heart hammering against his ribs. The apartment was silent except for his mother's soft breathing from her bedroom. She'd made it home from her shift just after midnight. Rick's snoring rattled through the thin walls like a warning. George dressed in the bathroom, his hands shaking as he buttoned the white shirt. The stain on the collar seemed bigger in the fluorescent light, but it was all he had. He splashed water on his face, careful around the bruise that had deepened overnight into darker shades of purple. In the mirror, he looked like a kid playing dress-up, like someone pretending to be brave. His phone read 7:43 a.m. School started at 8:30. Career day presentations began at 10. What if Walter forgot? What if yesterday was just some game to him, a mafia boss humoring a stupid kid with a black eye? George grabbed his backpack and slipped out of the apartment before Rick could wake up and ruin everything. The morning crawled by like torture. George sat through math class without hearing a single word. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, kept glancing at him with concern, but he avoided her eyes. During reading period, Evan Harrington and his friend Tyler cornered George by the water fountain. "So," Evan said, his voice dripping with mock curiosity. "Your imaginary dad coming today, Marino?" Tyler snickered. "Bet he's in jail. That's why he can't show up." George's fingers tightened around his backpack straps. "He's coming." "Right," Evan laughed. "Just like my dad's gonna bring his Ferrari. Oh wait, mine's actually real." "Leave me alone, Evan." "What's wrong? Gonna cry?" Evan shoved George's shoulder. Not hard enough to hurt, but enough to make him stumble. "Face it, loser. Nobody's coming for you. Nobody ever does." George wanted to say something back, wanted to defend himself. But the truth was, a part of him believed Evan was right. Hope was dangerous. Hope was what got you hurt when reality came crashing back. The bell rang for break, then second period, then, finally, the announcement crackled over the intercom. Career day presentations will begin in 10 minutes. All parents should report to their students' classroom. George's stomach twisted into knots. Room 204 slowly filled with parents, moms in business casual, dads in work uniforms, one father in a firefighter's dress blues. They chatted easily, confidently, like they belonged. Evan's father arrived in an expensive suit, already commanding attention. Tyler's mom brought homemade cookies. One by one, every kid's parent showed up, except George's. 9:55 a.m. Mrs. Patterson gave George a sympathetic look that made his chest burn with shame. "George, honey, if no one's able to make it today." The classroom windows rattled. It was subtle at first, just a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. Then it grew louder, deeper, the kind of sound that made conversations stop mid-sentence. Mrs. Patterson moved to the window. Her face went pale. Oh my God. Every parent rushed to see what she was staring at. George stayed in his seat, afraid to hope, afraid to look. But then he heard it. Car doors slamming. Not one, not two, multiple doors, synchronized like a military operation. Heavy footsteps in the hallway. George finally stood, his legs weak, and moved to the window. 4 black SUVs sat in the parking lot, windows tinted so dark they looked like holes cut into reality, chrome gleaming, engines still running. And standing beside them, adjusting their ties and checking their watches, were 8 men in dark suits. Walter stood at the front, his gray-streaked hair slicked back, his expression carved from stone. His suit probably cost more than George's rent. The tattoos on his neck were barely visible above his collar, but they were there, a reminder of who he was. Vincent stood to his right, massive and intimidating. Tony to his left, scanning the area like a Secret Service agent. Paulo held a leather folder, Behind them, 4 more men George didn't recognize, all standing with the same controlled stillness. They moved as one unit toward the school entrance. The hallway outside room 204 went silent. George heard Principal Hendrix's voice, nervous and high-pitched. "Excuse me, gentlemen. Do you have visitor badges? We have a strict policy. We're here for career day." Walter's voice cut through the air like a blade. Calm, controlled, undeniable. Room 204. George Marino's presentation. Yes, of course. Right this way." The classroom door opened. Walter Colombo stepped inside first, his eyes immediately finding George. Something softened in that cold gaze just for a second, just enough for George to see. Then the rest of the crew filed in behind him, filling the small classroom with their presence. They didn't threaten, didn't posture. They simply existed in a way that made everyone else feel smaller. Mrs. Patterson's hands fluttered nervously. "Mr. Colombo," Walter said, extending his hand with perfect politeness. "Walter Colombo. I'm here for George." He crossed the room and placed his hand on George's shoulder, the same protective grip from yesterday. George looked up at him, eyes wide and glistening. "Told you we'd handle it," Walter said quietly, just for George to hear. Behind them, Evan Harrington had gone completely silent. His earlier confidence evaporated. His father stared at Walter with recognition and something that looked a lot like fear. Vincent leaned down to George with a slight smile. "Where do you want us, kid?" George couldn't speak. His throat was too tight. But he managed to point to the front of the classroom where parents were gathering to present. Walter nodded once. "Then that's where we'll be." Every dangerous, tattooed, impossibly intimidating man in that crew moved to stand behind George's desk like an honor guard. And for the first time in 2 years, George Marino felt safe. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat 3 times before she could speak. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her cardigan, eyes darting between Walter's imposing figure and the manual on her desk about career day procedures that definitely didn't cover what to do when the Mafia showed up. "Well," she managed, her voice cracking only slightly. Let's begin. We'll go alphabetically. Anderson family, you're first." George barely heard the presentations. Tyler's mom talked about nursing. Another parent discussed accounting. Evan's father droned on about commercial real estate development, his voice carrying the arrogant confidence of old money. But his eyes kept sliding toward Walter, and each time they did, he stumbled over his words. Finally, Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through George's anxious haze. "George Marino, you're next." George stood on shaking legs. Walter rose with him, one hand still resting protectively on his shoulder. The entire crew moved as one, creating a wall of suits and controlled power at the front of the classroom. Every parent leaned back slightly. Every kid sat up straighter. Walter positioned himself beside George, his presence somehow making George feel both smaller and infinitely larger at the same time. Vincent and Tony flanked them. Paulo opened his leather folder. The other men stood at attention, hands clasped in front of them like Secret Service agents. "My name is George Marino," George started, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at Walter, who gave him the slightest nod of encouragement. "And this is Walter Colombo and his family." The word felt right, more right than it should have. Walter stepped forward, his movements economical and precise. When he spoke, his voice filled the room without rising in volume, the kind of voice that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. "I run a private security and community investment firm," Walter said, the technical truth wrapped in careful language. "My organization operates throughout the city, providing protection services and financial support to neighborhoods that traditional institutions often overlook." He paused, letting that sink in. "But what my business card says doesn't define who we are. What defines us is what we do when nobody's watching." He gestured to Paulo, who pulled out photographs from the folder. "Last month, we funded a complete renovation of the Oakwood Community Center. 3 months ago, we provided scholarships to 15 students whose families couldn't afford school supplies." Paulo held up documentation receipts, thank you letters, photographs of smiling kids holding backpacks. "We deliver meals to elderly residents who can't leave their homes," Tony added, his rough voice surprisingly gentle. "Every Sunday, rain or shine, for 5 years now." Vincent spoke next. "We've helped 3 families avoid eviction by negotiating with landlords and covering emergency expenses. Not loans, gifts. Because community isn't about profit, it's about showing up when people have nowhere else to turn." Mrs. Patterson's expression had shifted from fear to confusion to something approaching wonder. Other parents whispered to each other. Walter's eyes swept across the classroom, landing on each face with calculated precision. "Society sees men like us and makes assumptions. They see the tattoos, the cars, the reputation, and they decide we're villains. His voice hardened slightly. Sometimes they're right. But we're also the ones who answer calls that 911 puts on hold. We're the ones who walk streets the police won't patrol. We protect what matters. His hand returned to George's shoulder. And when an 11-year-old kid shows up at my door asking for help, we don't turn him away. We show up. All of us. The silence in the classroom was absolute. George felt something crack open in his chest, something warm and overwhelming that he couldn't name. These men, these dangerous, feared men, had driven across the city and walked into an elementary school for him. Not for money, not for leverage. For him. The bell rang for recess, shattering the moment. Kids exploded toward the door, but George noticed how they gave Walter's crew a wide berth, a mixture of fear and awe on their faces. "That was incredible," Mrs. Patterson said quietly to Walter, though her voice still carried uncertainty. George is lucky to have such dedicated support. Walter's expression didn't change. "We're the lucky ones, ma'am." As students filed outside, Mrs. Patterson gently touched George's arm. "Can I speak with Mr. Colombo privately for a moment?" George's heart dropped. Was she going to call the police? Tell them to leave? But Walter nodded calmly. "Vincent, take George outside. We'll be right there." Vincent's massive hand engulfed George's shoulder as he guided him toward the door. George looked back to see Mrs. Patterson closing the classroom door, her expression serious. Outside, kids clustered in groups, whispering and pointing at the SUVs. Evans stood near the basketball court, his earlier confidence completely shattered, but Tyler stood beside him, and as George approached with Vincent looming behind him, something ugly flickered in Tyler's eyes. "So your dad is a criminal," Tyler said loud enough for others to hear. "That's why he brought bodyguards. Probably going to jail after this." Vincent's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. George opened his mouth to respond, but Evans surprised everyone by stepping forward. Not in George's defense, but not an attack either. He looked confused, conflicted, his eyes distant. "Shut up, Tyler," Evan muttered. "What? What?" "Just, shut up." Evan walked away, leaving Tyler standing there bewildered. Vincent crouched down to George's level, his voice low. "Boss is gonna want to know something, kid. That bruise on your face, is it the first time that boyfriend of your mom's hit you?" George's silence was answer enough. Vincent's expression darkened. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Through the classroom window, George could see Mrs. Patterson talking urgently to Walter, gesturing with her hands. Walter stood perfectly still, listening with the intensity of a man gathering intelligence. Something was shifting. George could feel it. This wasn't just career day anymore. Walter emerged from the classroom 15 minutes later, his expression unreadable but his movements sharper, more purposeful. He walked straight to George, who stood near the playground equipment with Vincent watching over him like a guardian statue. "We need to talk," Walter said quietly, crouching down so they were eye level. "Your teacher shared some things with me, concerns she's had for a while." George's stomach twisted. "I didn't say anything, I swear." "I know you didn't." Walter's voice was gentle but firm. "But teachers notice things, kid. Bruises that show up on Mondays, homework assignments that never get finished, the way you flinch when someone raises their voice." George felt his face burn with shame. He'd tried so hard to hide it all, to be invisible, to not cause problems. "She's required by law to report suspected abuse," Walter continued. "But reports get filed, investigated, and sometimes nothing changes. Sometimes kids slip through the cracks." His tattooed hand came to rest on George's shoulder. "I don't let kids slip through cracks." Vincent's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then at Walter. "Tony's got the hospital supervisor on the line. George's mom is confirmed working a double started at 6 this morning. Won't be done until 10 tonight." Walter nodded slowly, something calculating moving behind his eyes. He stood and made a quick gesture. Within seconds, his entire crew had formed a loose circle around them, creating privacy in the middle of the crowded playground. "Paulo," Walter said quietly, "I need everything. Medical records every time the kid or his mother showed up at an ER or urgent care in the last 6 months. Cross-reference with her work schedule." Paulo was already typing on his phone. "On it. I've got a contact in medical records at City General who owes us a favor. Vincent, I want surveillance footage from their apartment building, lobby cameras, parking lot, anything that shows patterns of movement. When does Rick come and go? How often? Is he employed?" "Already made the call," Vincent replied. "Building Super's son got into some trouble last year. We helped make it disappear. He'll cooperate. Tony, police reports. Any domestic disturbance calls to that address. Any history on Rick, full name Richard Castellano, age 37. I want to know if he's done this before." Tony pulled out a small notebook, scribbling rapidly. "I'll have it by tonight." George watched this unfold with growing disbelief. These men were mobilizing like a military operation for him, not with guns or threats, but with phones and contacts and the kind of systematic information gathering that law enforcement would take weeks to accomplish. "What about the boyfriend?" Vincent asked, his voice dropping lower. "Want me to pay him a visit?" "Nothing permanent. Just educational." "No." Walter's response was immediate and sharp. "We do this clean, legal, airtight. If we touch him, it muddies everything. We build a case so solid that he can't hide behind excuses or charm his way out." He turned back to George. "When does Rick usually get home?" "Around 5, George whispered. "He works construction sometimes, but mostly he just drinks and gets angry." "Does he hit your mother?" George's silence stretched too long. "George," Walter's voice gentled, "does he hit your mother?" "She says he doesn't mean it," George said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. "She says he's stressed about money, that he's trying to help us, that she can handle it. But I hear them sometimes at night. I hear her crying in the bathroom after he leaves for the bar." Walter's jaw worked silently. Behind him, Vincent's massive hands curled into fists. Tony looked away, his own childhood demons clearly surfacing. "How long has he lived with you?" 6 months. He said we needed help with rent after Dad died. Mom was struggling with all the bills and the funeral costs and everything. Rick seemed nice at first. He brought groceries, fixed the sink, made her laugh. George's voice cracked. Then he moved in and everything changed. Paulo looked up from his phone. "Just got confirmation George has been to the ER twice in the last 4 months. Once for a fall down the stairs, once for a bike accident. Both times his mother brought him in during her shifts at the hospital, so she could make sure the paperwork looked clean," Tony muttered. "Smart, tragic, but smart." Walter stood, his mind clearly working through strategies. "We need to move carefully. If we spook him, he could hurt them and run. If we go through official channels too fast, there's a chance George ends up in foster care while they investigate." "What about protective custody?" Vincent suggested. "For how long? And based on what hard evidence? A bruise and a teacher's suspicions?" Walter shook his head. "We need more. We need a pattern that's undeniable." George felt panic rising. "What if he finds out you're looking into him? What if he gets mad at my mom because of this?" Walter crouched back down, meeting George's terrified gaze with absolute certainty. "Listen to me very carefully. From this moment forward, you and your mother are under our protection. Rick doesn't know that yet, but he will. And when he does, he'll understand that touching either of you again would be the last mistake he ever makes." "But you said no violence." "I said we're doing this legal," Walter corrected. "That doesn't mean we're doing it soft. It means we're doing it smart. By the time we're done, Rick won't just leave, he'll be legally barred from ever coming near you again. Prison bars or restraining orders, I don't care which. But he's done." Vincent's phone buzzed again. He read the message and his expression darkened. "Boss. Building surveillance just came through. Rick's been bringing friends over when George's mom works nights. They're gambling. Cards and cash on the kitchen table. Multiple witnesses." Walter's smile was cold and sharp as a knife. "Illegal gambling in a residential building. That's a start," Paulo added. "Hospital records show George's mom treated for a sprained wrist 3 weeks ago. Signed off as fell at work. But the attending physician's notes indicate inconsistency with her explanation. The pieces were falling into place." Walter straightened, his voice carrying command. 24 hours. I want everything documented, verified, and ready to present. We move on this tomorrow night." He looked down at George. "Can you be strong for one more day?" George nodded, not trusting his voice. "Good, because tomorrow this ends." George barely slept that night. Every creak of the apartment, every footstep in the hallway outside sent his heart racing. He lay in his bed, fully clothed, clutching his phone like a lifeline. Walter's number pulled up and ready to call. Rick had come home drunk just after 9, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. George heard his mother's voice, low and pleading. Heard Rick's angry response, slurred words about disrespect and embarrassment. Then he heard her crying. George pressed his pillow over his head and counted the minutes until silence returned. The next day at school felt surreal. George moved through his classes like a ghost, barely registering lessons or conversation. Mrs. Patterson kept glancing at him with concern. During lunch, Evan Harrington sat 3 tables away, staring at his food without eating, his usual smugness completely absent. Something had shifted in Evan too. George noticed it but couldn't process why. At 3:15 p.m., the final bell rang. George gathered his things slowly, deliberately delaying the walk home. His phone buzzed a text from Walter. "Vincent is outside in the gray sedan. He'll follow you home. You're not alone. George's hands shook as he typed back. Rick saw the photos from career day. They're online. He knows. The response came instantly. We're already moving. Get home. Act normal. We'll be there before dark. The apartment was too quiet when George unlocked the door. No television. No sounds from the kitchen. Just silence that felt heavy and wrong. Then he saw Rick sitting at the kitchen table, a laptop open in front of him. His bloodshot eyes tracked George's movement across the room. On the screen, George could see images from yesterday, Walter's crew standing beside him, the black SUVs, the unmistakable presence of organized crime walking into an elementary school. So, Rick said, his voice dangerously calm. You've got friends now. Dangerous friends. George froze, his backpack suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. You think I'm scared? Rick stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. You think some gangsters showing up at your little school means anything? You think they're gonna protect you? They're not gangsters, George whispered. They're criminals, you stupid kid. Rick moved closer, and George could smell the alcohol on his breath even from 6 feet away. And you just made everything worse. You know what your mom's gonna think when she finds out you've been hanging around with the Mafia? When child services starts asking questions because you couldn't keep your mouth shut? George backed toward his bedroom door. I didn't tell anyone anything. Your teacher pulled your mom aside today at the hospital. Asked her about concerning patterns. Asked if everything was okay at home. Rick's face flushed red. You're making your mother look bad. Making us look bad. After everything I've done for this family. You hit me! The words burst out of George before he could stop them. You hit my mom. You don't help us. You hurt us. Rick's expression twisted into something ugly and familiar. You ungrateful little... The slap came fast, harder than before. George's head snapped to the side, his cheek exploding with pain. He stumbled backward, hitting the wall. That's for embarrassing me, Rick snarled. And for thinking you're brave enough to... The front door didn't knock. It simply opened. Walter Colombo stepped inside first, his presence filling the entire apartment. Vincent followed, then Tony, then Paulo. They moved with the controlled precision of men who'd done this 1,000 times, positioning themselves strategically around the small space. Rick's face drained of color. Step away from the boy. Walter's voice was quiet, calm, and absolutely lethal. This is my home, Rick managed, though his voice cracked. You can't just... Your home? Walter pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket and tossed it onto the kitchen table. You're not on the lease. You don't pay rent. You're a guest who's overstayed his welcome. Vincent moved to George, gently guiding him to the side, checking his face, where Rick's handprint was already blooming red. Paulo opened a leather folder, spreading photographs and documents across the table like evidence in a courtroom. Hospital records showing a pattern of injuries to both George and his mother. Security footage of illegal gambling operations run from this apartment. Police reports from 3 previous addresses where you were involved in domestic disturbances. Tony added another stack of papers. Financial records showing you've contributed exactly $0 to household expenses in 6 months. Witness statements from neighbors describing shouting, violence, and intimidation. Rick's eyes darted between the men, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. You can't prove anything. It's all circumstantial. I'll lawyer up. You don't have money for a lawyer, Walter said, picking up one of the documents. You're $40,000 in debt, most of it to people who don't take IOUs. He set it down with finality. But here's what you do have: a protective order filed this afternoon by George's mother, signed by a judge, prohibiting you from coming within 500 feet of her or her son. Rick's face went white. Elena didn't, she wouldn't. She did. With encouragement and legal representation we provided. Walter stepped closer, his voice dropping to something that made even his own men tense. You have 1 hour to pack your essentials and leave. Anything you don't take tonight will be donated. Your key stops working at midnight. You can't do this. It's already done. Walter's cold eyes held no mercy. The only question is whether you leave quietly, or whether I call the officers who are currently parked 2 blocks away waiting for my signal. Rick's hands trembled. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem. Walter gestured to the door. But I'll tell you what will be my problem if you ever come near this family again. If you call, text, email, or so much as drive down this street, you'll discover that protective orders are just pieces of paper. What I offer is much more permanent. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but perfectly clear. Rick grabbed a jacket from the chair, his movements jerky and panicked. He headed for the door, then stopped, looking back at George with something between rage and desperation. This isn't over. Vincent stepped forward, all 6'4" of muscle and controlled violence. Yeah, it is. Rick fled. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like freedom. George's legs gave out, He slid down the wall, tears streaming down his face, not from pain, but from relief so overwhelming it felt like drowning. Walter crouched beside him, that same protective hand finding his shoulder. "It's over, kid. He's gone, and he's never coming back." 3 days passed in a strange, quiet peace George had almost forgotten existed. The apartment felt bigger without Rick's looming presence. His mother came home from her shifts and actually smiled, tired, cautious smiles, but real ones. She'd hugged Walter so tightly when she learned what he'd done that the dangerous Mafia boss had actually looked uncomfortable. But at school, George noticed something odd. Evan Harrington was falling apart. The boy who'd tormented him for months now sat alone at lunch, picking at food he didn't eat. His designer clothes looked rumpled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. During Mrs. Patterson's class, Evan stared out the window with the kind of hollow expression George recognized from his own mirror. On Thursday afternoon, George watched Evan slump against his locker, head in his hands, completely still. Other kids walked past without noticing. But George saw something he'd been too hurt to see before. Evan looked exactly like George had looked 2 weeks ago. Broken, scared, alone. George pulled out his phone and texted Walter. "Something's wrong with Evan, the kid who used to bully me. Can you look into it?" The response came within minutes. "Already on it. Been watching him since career day. Something didn't sit right." That evening, Vincent sat in a parked car outside the Harrington estate, a sprawling property in the wealthiest part of the city, complete with iron gates and manicured lawns. The kind of place that screamed money and privilege. But Vincent had learned decades ago that expensive houses often hid the ugliest secrets. Through surveillance equipment Walter's crew had been using for 3 days, Vincent watched Evan's father, David Harrington, pace his home office like a caged animal. The man's tie was loosened, his expensive suit jacket thrown over a chair. Empty whiskey bottles lined the credenza. The phone on the desk rang. David answered. And even through the surveillance feed, Vincent could hear the desperation in his voice. "I told you. I need more time. No, I can't come up with that kind of cash by Friday. You don't understand. The development deal fell through." Vincent's jaw tightened. He'd heard this story before. Successful man overextends himself, starts gambling to fix it, digs the hole deeper, then takes it out on everyone around him. He texted Walter. "Father's drowning. Gambling debts. Minimum $200K. Based on the conversation I'm hearing. He's breaking." Walter's response. "The son?" Vincent adjusted the camera angle and found Evan through a different window sitting on his bed, knees pulled to his chest, staring at nothing. His room was enormous, filled with expensive gaming equipment and sports trophies. But the kid looked like he was sitting in a prison cell. "The son's collateral damage," Vincent typed back. "Classic emotional neglect. Kid's invisible until the father needs someone to yell at." The next morning, Evan didn't show up for school. George felt an unexpected twist of worry. During lunch, he approached Tyler cautiously. "Have you heard from Evan?" Tyler shrugged, uncomfortable. His dad pulled him out for the day, said it was a family matter. "Evan texted me last night saying his dad lost it, smashed a bunch of stuff in the house." George's stomach dropped. He texted Walter immediately. 20 minutes later, during math class, George's phone buzzed with a message that made his heart race. "Meeting with Evan's father this afternoon. Stay close to your phone." David Harrington's office was all dark wood and leather, the kind of space designed to intimidate. But when Walter Colombo walked in with Vincent and Tony flanking him, it was clear who held the power. David stood behind his desk, trying to project authority his bloodshot eyes couldn't support. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I have lawyers." "Sit down," Walter said quietly. Something in his voice made David obey despite himself. Walter placed a folder on the desk. "Your son has been bullying a boy under my protection. At first, I assumed it was just cruelty, kids being kids. But then I started looking closer." He opened the folder, revealing photographs, financial documents, and surveillance logs. "You're drowning in debt. Illegal gambling, failed real estate deals, loans from people who don't negotiate payment plans. You're leveraged to the point of collapse." Walter's finger tapped a document. "And when you get home every night, you take that stress out on your 11-year-old son. Not physically, you're too smart for that. But emotionally, you've been destroying that kid, piece by piece." David's face flushed red. "How dare you? My relationship with my son is none of your son is hurting other kids because he's learned that's how you handle pain, you pass it down." Walter leaned forward, his voice dropping to something sharp and unforgiving. "And I don't tolerate that. Not anymore. What do you want? Money? I don't have. I don't want your money." Walter pulled out another document. "I want you to fix yourself. Gambling addiction counseling. I've already arranged it with a specialist. Financial restructuring. Paulo here will help you negotiate with your creditors. And therapy. For you and your son. Together. David stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Why would you? Because your son shouldn't pay for your failures. Walter's expression was stone. And because breaking the cycle of pain is the only thing that matters. He stood, straightening his suit. You have a choice. Accept help, show up for your kid, and rebuild your life. Or refuse. And watch everything collapse. Your finances, your reputation, your family. Those gambling debts? They don't disappear. But I can make them manageable if you prove you're worth the investment. David's hands shook as he reached for the papers. And if I say no, then your son grows up to be exactly like you, broken, bitter, and hurting everyone around him. Walter's eyes were merciless. Is that what you want? For a long moment, David sat in silence. Then, slowly, his carefully constructed facade crumbled. His shoulders sagged, his face crumpled. I don't know how to fix this, he whispered. I don't know how to fix any of this. That's why we're here, Walter said, his voice gentling slightly. But you have to want it. You have to choose your son over your pride. David looked at the papers again, counseling schedules, financial plans, therapy referrals, a roadmap out of the darkness he'd created. Where's Evan now? Walter asked. Upstairs, in his room. He won't talk to me. Walter nodded to Vincent. Bring him down. 2 minutes later, Vincent returned with Evan, the boy's eyes red-rimmed, his expression wary and exhausted. Evan froze when he saw Walter. Sit down, son, Walter said gently. Evan sat beside his father, as far away as the couch allowed. Walter crouched in front of them both. Evan, your father has some things he needs to say, and this time, he's going to mean them. David Harrington stared at his hands for what felt like an eternity. The expensive office, the leather furniture, the framed awards on the walls, all of it seemed to mock him now. Walter stood perfectly still, waiting with the patience of a man who understood that some truths couldn't be rushed. Finally, David turned to his son. Evan, his voice cracked. I've failed you. Not just recently, for a long time now. Evan's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the floor. I told myself I was working hard for our family, that the pressure I felt was just part of being successful. But the truth is, I was chasing something that didn't matter. And when it all started falling apart, I blamed everyone except myself. David's hands trembled. I blamed the market, the economy, bad luck. And then I started blaming you for needing things, for existing. A tear slid down Evan's cheek, but he didn't move. You weren't supposed to hear me on the phone with creditors. You weren't supposed to know I was gambling away your college fund trying to fix my mistakes. You weren't supposed to feel like you had to be invisible just to keep me from exploding. David's voice broke completely. But you knew. You knew everything. And instead of protecting you, I made you feel like you were the problem. Evan finally looked up, his face wet with tears. I thought if I was tougher, meaner like you get when you're angry, maybe you'd notice me. Maybe you'd be proud. David's composure shattered. He reached for his son, and Evan collapsed into his arms, both of them crying in a way that spoke of months, maybe years of pain finally breaking through. Walter stepped back, giving them space. Vincent and Tony exchanged looks that carried their own childhood wounds. After several minutes, David pulled back, wiping his face. What do I do now? How do I fix this? Walter handed him the folder again. You start by showing up. Counseling twice a week, both individual and family sessions. Paulo will meet with you Monday to restructure your debts. You'll work a real job, not schemes. You'll be honest with your son about where you are in recovery. He turned to Evan. And you're going to learn that strength isn't about hurting others. Real strength is admitting when you're broken and asking for help. Evan nodded slowly, then looked at his father. I'm sorry I bullied George. I took out everything I felt on him because he seemed weaker than me. But he wasn't weak. He was braver than I've ever been. Then you tell him that, Walter said, face to face. The next Monday, Evan walked up to George during lunch. The cafeteria went quiet, expecting another confrontation. Instead, Evan's voice came out small and genuine. Can we talk? George hesitated, then nodded. They walked to an empty corner of the cafeteria. Evan's hands twisted together nervously. I'm sorry. For everything. The things I said. The way I treated you. You didn't deserve any of it. George studied him carefully. Why'd you do it? Because I was angry and scared and I didn't know how to deal with it. My dad's been falling apart, and I felt like I was drowning, and hurting you made me feel like I had control over something. Evan's voice cracked. But it was wrong. You were dealing with worse things than me, and you never took it out on anyone. George felt something shift in his chest. My life was pretty bad, but it got better because someone showed up when I needed them. Maybe you need that too. Evan looked up, surprised. Walter runs this youth program, George continued. Boxing, mentorship, learning how to build things. It's helped me. Maybe it could help you too. You'd want me there? After everything? George thought about it, then extended his hand. Yeah, I would. Evan shook it, and something like hope flickered in his eyes. 2 weeks later, both boys stood in Walter's community gym, learning to wrap their hands for boxing training. Vincent demonstrated proper stance. Tony taught them how to channel anger into discipline rather than destruction. George's mother arrived after her shift, bringing sandwiches. David Harrington showed up too, sober and present, watching his son with genuine attention for the first time in months. Walter stood at the back, arms crossed, observing the transformation. You did good, boss, Vincent said quietly. They did the work, Walter replied. We just showed them it was possible. George and Evan sparred lightly, both laughing when they stumbled. Two broken kids learning to heal together, surrounded by dangerous men who'd learned that true strength meant protecting the vulnerable. Family wasn't just blood anymore. It was whoever showed up when everything fell apart and stayed to help rebuild what was broken. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick and official. Walter turned it over in his tattooed hands, recognizing the seal of George's high school immediately. Vincent leaned against the office doorframe, coffee in hand, watching with knowing eyes. Graduation invitation, Vincent said. It wasn't a question. Walter opened it carefully. Inside, a handwritten note fell out. Walter, you changed my life 7 years ago when you showed up at Career Day. Now I'm asking you to show up one more time. I graduate top of my class on June 10th, and I want you there. You and the entire family. Please come watch me walk across that stage. I wouldn't be here without you. George. Walter stared at the note longer than necessary, something tightening in his chest that he refused to name. We going? Vincent asked. Yeah, Walter said quietly. We're going. 7 years had transformed the scared 11-year-old into someone Walter barely recognized. George Marino stood at 6 feet now, lean and confident, his bruises long healed and replaced with the quiet strength of someone who'd survived and thrived. He'd spent those years in Walter's mentorship program, learning discipline, focus, and purpose. He'd volunteered at the same community center Walter's crew had renovated. He'd maintained a 4 gigapascals while working part-time to help his mother with bills. He'd become friends with Evan Harrington, and together they'd created an anti-bullying program at their school. But more than academics or achievements, George had learned what it meant to be a good man, from watching Walter and his crew operate protecting the vulnerable, keeping their word, showing up when it mattered. Now, as the graduation ceremony approached, George stood in his cap and gown backstage, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of how far he'd come. His mother appeared beside him, her nurse's uniform replaced with a dress for the occasion. The exhaustion that had defined her 7 years ago had faded. She'd remarried last year a kind radiologist from City General, who treated her and George with the gentleness they deserved. Rick was a distant, ugly memory. You ready? She asked, adjusting his cap. Yeah, George said. Is Walter here? Walter, Vincent, Tony, Paulo, and about 6 others I didn't recognize. She smiled. They're sitting in the back row. Apparently, they didn't want to draw attention. George laughed. Like they could ever not draw attention. The principal's voice echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the graduating class. The ceremony was a blur of names and applause. George barely registered any of it until he heard his own name called. George Marino valedictorian, graduating summa cum laude, recipient of the Community Leadership Award. George walked across the stage to thunderous applause, but his eyes found the back row immediately 8 men in dark suits standing as one, clapping with genuine pride etched on weathered faces. Walter's cold expression had softened into something George had only seen a handful of times. Pride, respect, and something that looked a lot like love. After receiving his diploma, George stepped to the podium for his valedictorian speech. His prepared notes sat in his pocket, but he didn't need them. 7 years ago, George began, his voice steady and clear. I was broken. My father had died. My mother worked herself to exhaustion. Her boyfriend used me as a punching bag. I had nowhere to turn and no one to help me. The audience had gone silent. So I did something crazy. I walked into the office of the most feared man in the city and asked him to be my dad for one day. George's eyes found Walter. He said yes, but he didn't just show up for one day. He showed up for 7 years. He and his family taught me that strength isn't about violence. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, recognizing who George was talking about. Society tells us that men like Walter Colombo are villains, that organized crime is just about money and power and hurting people. George's voice grew stronger, but they never tell you about the scholarships his organization funds, The meals delivered to struggling families, the community centers rebuilt, the kids like me who were saved. He paused, emotion threatening to crack his composure. Family isn't blood. It's the people who show up when you're broken and stay to watch you heal. It's the people who see potential in a scared kid with a black eye and decide he's worth fighting for. George looked directly at Walter now. Thank you for being my family. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. And thank you for proving that sometimes the most unexpected people become our greatest heroes. The auditorium erupted in applause. Several people stood first, George's mother, then Evan and his father, then more and more until the entire crowd was on their feet, except for 8 men in the back row who remained seated, nodding with quiet dignity. After the ceremony, graduates flooded the lawn outside, taking photos with families and friends. George found himself surrounded by well-wishers, but his eyes kept scanning the crowd for Walter. He finally spotted them near the parking lot, the entire crew standing beside their familiar black SUVs, waiting patiently while others celebrated. George excused himself and walked over, his graduation gown flapping in the evening breeze. As he approached, the men straightened, their expressions carrying the kind of pride fathers show sons. "Hell of a speech, kid," Vincent said, his gravel voice touched with emotion. "Made me look soft in front of 500 people," Walter added, but there was warmth in his eyes that betrayed his words. George laughed. "You are soft. You just hide it better than most." Tony clapped him on the shoulder. "What's next? College?" "Full scholarship to State University," George confirmed. "Criminal justice program. I want to work in community advocacy, help kids like I was." Walter nodded slowly. "You'll be good at it." "Because I learned from the best." George's voice grew serious. "I meant what I said in there. You saved my life. All of you did." Paulo stepped forward, holding a small velvet box. "Then you'll understand what this means." George took the box with trembling hands and opened it. Inside, resting on black silk, was a silver pin, the Colombo family crest. Not the symbol of criminal enterprise, but the private emblem Walter's crew used to identify their own. Family, protection, loyalty. "It's not about crime," Walter said quietly. "It's about belonging. You earned this, George. Not because you're useful to us, but because you're one of us. You always will be." George's vision blurred with tears. He'd seen these pins on each man's lapel for years, symbols of unbreakable bonds. To receive one meant something beyond words. "I don't know what to say," George whispered. "You already said it," Walter replied, in front of everyone. That took guts. George pinned it to his gown, right over his heart. Then, without thinking, he stepped forward and hugged Walter tightly, the dangerous Mafia boss who'd become the father he needed. Walter stiffened for just a moment, then his arms came up, returning the embrace with surprising gentleness. "Thank you," George whispered, "for everything." "No, kid," Walter said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. "Thank you. You reminded us why we do this, why any of it matters." When they separated, Evan appeared, also in his cap and gown, his own family trailing behind. David Harrington approached Walter and extended his hand. "I never properly thanked you," David said, "for saving my son, and me." Walter shook his hand firmly. "You saved yourself. I just showed you the door." Evan and George stood together, 2 kids who'd been enemies transformed into brothers through shared pain and healing. George's mother joined them, throwing her arms around Walter in a hug that made the stoic man look genuinely uncomfortable. His crew laughed, the sound warm and genuine. As the sun set over the graduation ceremony, painting everything in gold, George looked around at the people who'd become his true family, not through blood or obligation, but through choice and loyalty, and showing up when it mattered most. Walter caught his eye and gave a single nod, the kind of acknowledgement that meant everything. George nodded back, understanding passing between them without words. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, and whatever came next, George knew he'd never walk alone again. Thanks for sticking with this story till the end. If you enjoyed it, you're going to love the next one. It's packed with unexpected turns and heartfelt moments. Click the image on your screen to keep the journey going, and make sure to hit subscribe for more amazing stories. Drop a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I can't wait to see what you think.